All right, put your arms behind your back. Don't resist. Stop tensing up.
Hold on, I just need my phone. I got a call. I need
now.
God is right.
Man, come on.
They're gonna take my baby.
I didn't do anything.
Please.
Ma'am, step back. Let us do our job.
He's not like
Cuffs
this,
secure.
please.
Got him.
You're cuffed. Relax your
Please
shoulders.
don't
Ma'am,
take
back
us.
up.
The trouble began on a standard Tuesday at Monroe Truck Equipment in Marshfield. Brandon had just been fired from his job, but he wasn't planning on leaving quietly. Instead of walking away and looking for new work, he let his anger take control. He marched back into the building and began shouting profanities at his former co-workers. The air was thick with tension as he made threatening statements that left the staff feeling unsafe. In a fit of rage, Brandon grabbed his tools and began throwing them across the shop floor. Heavy hammers flew through the air, clattering against the hard ground. One of the thrown tools struck a customer's vehicle, causing visible damage to the body of the car. Brandon later claimed he was just cleaning his toolbox and that the staff freaked out for no reason, but the damage was already done. He had turned a simple termination into a criminal scene, and the consequences were already set in motion. Roxy's anger was just as hot as Brandon's. After the first incident at the shop, she didn't try to calm him down or tell him to stay away. Instead, she got behind the wheel of her car and drove him back to Monroe Truck Equipment for a second time. The staff watched in fear as the car sped into the parking lot. Roxy drove aggressively, swerving and cutting corners to show her frustration. She didn't just stay in the car, she leaned out and began shouting threats at the employees who were just trying to do their jobs. The sound of her tires screeching against the pavement filled the air as she peeled out, leaving behind a cloud of smoke and a group of very worried people. She felt powerful in that moment, but she didn't realize that her reckless driving was being recorded and reported. By turning her car into a tool for intimidation, she had guaranteed that the police would be looking for them very soon. A few hours after the trouble at the shop, the police arrived at Roxy and Dane's home. They didn't come with sirens blaring, but their presence was still heavy. One officer stepped up to the door and called out for Roxy, asking if they could talk. Roxy's reaction was immediate and cold. From inside the house, she shouted back that they should talk to Dane because she had nothing to say. When the officers asked them to come outside so they could speak fairly, Roxy flatly refused, telling them she did not want them in her house. The air grew tense as Roxy and Dane stood their ground inside. Roxy kept asking why the police were there and what was going on. Even though she knew what had happened earlier that day, she acted like she had no idea why the law had followed her home. She tried to close the door on the officers, hoping they would just go away. But the deputies weren't leaving. They explained that they needed to talk about what happened at Monroe Truck Equipment. The quiet afternoon at the apartment was over, and the stunned silence was about to be broken by a much louder conflict. As the officers stood in the hallway, the situation began to change. They weren't just there to ask questions anymore. One of the deputies looked at Roxy and Dane and told them clearly that they were being placed under arrest. Roxy's face went pale with shock. She kept asking why over and over again, unable to believe what was happening. The lead officer explained the reality of the situation. It was a probation hold. Because they were already on probation from previous trouble, their actions at the truck shop were a major violation. In the eyes of the law, they had broken the rules they promised to follow to stay out of jail. The stunned look on Roxy's face turned into pure panic as the word hold sank in. She started to realize that this wasn't something she could just talk her way out of or ignore. The freedom they had taken for granted was disappearing right in their own living room, and the consequences of their morning outburst were finally catching up to them. Roxy's world continued to crumble as the officers moved deeper into the apartment. The stunned silence of the living room was replaced by a cold, hard truth: they weren't going anywhere but jail. The lead officer explained that because they were on probation, the rules were different for them. Any trouble with the law meant an automatic hold, and their aggressive behavior earlier that day had made the decision easy for their probation officer. Roxy stared at the floor, her mind racing. She tried to bargain, asking the officers to just let her figure things out, but the handcuffs were already out. The officers explained that the probation hold was a legal order that they couldn't ignore. It didn't matter how much Roxy cried or claimed she hadn't done anything, the paperwork was already signed. The reality of their past mistakes had merged with their new ones, locking them into a situation they couldn't escape. As the metal clicked around her wrists, Roxy realized that her freedom was officially gone. Dane was not ready to give up as easily as Roxy. As the officers moved in to place him in handcuffs, he reached down and scooped up their young child. He held the baby tightly against his chest, using the little boy like a physical shield. He thought that if he was holding the baby, the officers wouldn't be able to grab him or take him away. The room filled with a new kind of fear. The officers stepped back slightly, trying to keep the situation from becoming dangerous for the child. They spoke firmly to Dane, telling him over and over to put the baby down in his crib. "Let's not make things worse in front of your kid," one officer warned. But Dane refused to listen. He demanded to call his probation officer while still clutching the child, acting as if he could dictate the rules of the arrest. The officer's patience was running out. They told Dane that if he didn't put the baby down right then, they would add a resisting arrest charge to his list of problems. The stunned look on Roxy's face grew even wider as she watched her boyfriend use their son to fight the law. She begged Dane to just talk to them, but he stayed defiant. For a few tense minutes, the safety of the baby was at risk because Dane was too proud to put his hands behind his back. The tension in the living room reached a breaking point as Dane continued to hold the baby while refusing to cooperate. The officers knew they had to act quickly to ensure the child's safety, but they had to be careful not to hurt the little boy in the process. Finally, Brandon was forced to put the child down in his crib, but even then, he didn't make it easy. As soon as his hands were free, the deputies moved in to secure him. Dane began to tense up his muscles, pulling his arms away and trying to twist out of the officer's grip. The room was filled with the sounds of a physical struggle, the heavy breathing of the officers, the clinking of metal handcuffs, and Roxy's hysterical screaming in the background. The officers repeatedly shouted for him to stop tensing up and to cooperate, but Dane continued to fight back. The camera on the officer's chest bounced and shook as they wrestled Dane toward the couch to get better leverage. Every time they almost had one wrist locked, he would jerk away again. Roxy was stunned by the violence of the moment, watching as her boyfriend's defiance turned a simple arrest into a dangerous physical battle. After several long seconds of straining and pulling, the deputies finally managed to click the cuffs shut. Dane was pinned down, his face pressed against the cushions, breathing hard and still muttering about his rights. The struggle was over, but the damage to their family was just getting started. Once the handcuffs were finally secure, the heavy energy in the room shifted from fighting to finishing the business at hand. The deputies needed to gather Roxy and Dane's belongings before taking them to jail. One officer asked for their house keys and phones. Still breathing hard from the struggle, Dane told them he wanted his phone put in his pocket, but the officers explained they would be taking it for safekeeping. Roxy was still in a stunned state, her eyes darting around the room as she tried to think of where their keys were. "I don't know where they are right now," she cried, her voice cracking with every word. She begged Dane to help her, but he was pinned down and unable to move. The officers moved calmly through the apartment, picking up the items they needed to lock the home behind them. As Roxy handed over what was requested, she looked at the officers with a face full of fear. She wasn't just losing her phone or her keys, she was handing over the last bits of her normal life. The officers assured her they would make sure the baby was taken care of, but Roxy could only focus on the metal in her hands and the empty feeling in her chest. The apartment that was their home just a few hours ago was now just a place they were being forced to leave behind. The sound of a heavy door opening signaled a new kind of trouble for Roxy and Dane. Social workers from Human Services had arrived at the apartment to take charge of the situation. While the deputies kept Dane secured, the social workers moved toward the crib where the little boy was resting. Roxy's stunned expression turned into a mask of pure agony. She realized that the officers weren't just taking her and Dane to jail, they were taking her child away from the only home he had ever known. The social workers spoke in soft, calm voices, trying to keep the baby from getting upset by all the noise and shouting. They checked to make sure he had everything he needed, like a diaper bag and a proper car seat. Watching a stranger lift her son out of his crib was more than Roxy could handle. She began to sob uncontrollably, begging the officers to let her stay or to call someone else to take the baby. But there was no one else available to help. The law required the child to be in a safe place while his parents were in custody. As the social workers walked toward the door with the baby in their arms, the apartment felt colder and emptier than it ever had before. The consequences of their actions had finally reached the most innocent person in the house. With the baby now in the arms of social workers, the reality of the situation turned into a wave of bitter anger for Brandon. As the deputies led him toward the patrol car, he didn't look at his own actions as the cause of the problem. Instead, he looked at the officers with pure hatred in his eyes. "You guys make my life a living hell," he spat, his voice shaking with rage. He ignored the fact that his own choices had led the police to his door. To him, the officers were the villains who were tearing his family apart for no reason. He shouted that he hadn't done anything wrong and that he hadn't hurt anyone or broken any laws. He tried to downplay the violence at the truck shop, claiming he was just throwing some hammers on the ground while cleaning his toolbox. In his mind, everyone else was freaking out over nothing. By blaming the law instead of himself, Brandon showed that he was still far away from understanding the true consequences of his behavior. As the officers moved Brandon toward the patrol car, his anger shifted toward the government itself. He began a loud rant, claiming that his rights were being ignored. "This is a communist state," he yelled, his voice echoing off the apartment buildings. He felt like he was being treated unfairly, and he used big words to show how upset he was with the system. Brandon didn't want to accept that his probation hold was a result of his own behavior. Instead, he argued that the rules were being used to punish him for no reason. He kept complaining about his missing keys and his inability to call his lawyer right that second. To Brandon, the deputies weren't just doing their jobs, they were part of a bigger plan to make his life difficult. He sat in the hard plastic seat of the police car, still shouting about how the state was taking away his freedom, even though his own actions at the truck shop were the real reason he was there. The officers led Roxy toward the second patrol car, her hands cuffed behind her back. The stunned look on her face had turned into a full emotional breakdown. As the heavy door of the cruiser opened, she saw the metal cage inside the small, cramped space that would be her home for the next hour. She climbed into the back seat, and the sound of the door slamming shut felt like the end of her life. Inside the cage, Roxy began to sob. She leaned her head against the cool plastic of the partition, her body shaking with every breath. She cried out about her baby and how she didn't have anyone else to help him. The reality of being locked up was finally hitting her. She wasn't just in trouble, she was trapped. The small windows of the police car showed her the apartment building one last time as the engine started. Roxy felt a deep sense of despair, realizing that her choices had led her from a comfortable home to the back of a police cage in just a few hours. Inside the police car, a high-stress situation led to a new kind of conflict, the blame game. Dane sat in the back of the cruiser, his anger now turning toward Roxy. Instead of admitting that his own choices at the truck shop caused the arrest, he began to point the finger at her. He complained to the officers that Roxy was the one who was truly violent and that she was the person who always made things worse. He told the deputies that she drove him crazy and blamed her aggressive driving for the police following them home. Even though they were both in handcuffs for their shared actions, Dane wanted the officers to believe he was just a victim of her behavior. He tried to distance himself from her outbursts, hoping that by making her look like the bad one, he might receive a lighter punishment. Roxy, sitting in her own police car, was unaware that her boyfriend was already turning against her. The bond they had earlier that day was breaking under the pressure of the law. As the car sat idling in the driveway, the couple began to realize that their partnership was falling apart just as fast as their freedom. The stunned silence between them was filled with unspoken blame and the cold reality that they were now facing the system alone. Chapter 14. As the police cars began to pull away, Kayla felt a sudden rush of panic. She realized she was being separated from Brandon and their child without even a moment to say a proper goodbye. From the back of the squad car, she begged the officers to let her see them one last time. She cried out that she wouldn't be able to speak to Brandon once they were at the jail, and the thought of leaving her baby with strangers was more than she could bear. The officers, however, stood firm in their decision. They explained that they didn't want to cause another disturbance by bringing the two of them together while they were both so upset. The deputies believed that Kayla's strong emotions would only upset the baby further. Brandon also asked to kiss his son, but the officers told him they had already worked through that and were heading out. Despite her repeated pleas and tears, the windows stayed up and the doors stayed locked. Kayla watched through the glass as her home and her family disappeared from view. The chance to say a final word or give a final hug was gone. She was left alone with her thoughts in the back of the car, realizing that her stunned silence earlier had led to a loud and lonely departure. The patrol cars eventually reached the Wood County Jail, where the process of booking began. For Brandon and Kayla, the reality of their situation became even more cold and clinical. They were led inside the facility, away from the emotions of their home and into a world of stone walls and iron bars. The stunned feeling they had in their living room was replaced by the loud, echoing sounds of a jail intake area. The officers handed over the couple to the jail staff, who started the formal process of recording their arrival. Kayla and Brandon were separated immediately. Each had to go through a search to make sure they weren't carrying anything dangerous into the jail. Their personal items, like the keys and phones the officers had collected at the house, were placed into plastic bags and labeled with their names. During the booking, Brandon and Kayla were photographed for their mugshots and had their fingerprints taken. Even though they were still upset, the jail staff treated the situation as just another part of the day's work. Kayla continued to worry about her baby, but here, she was no longer a mother, she was a person on a probation hold. The couple was dressed in jail uniforms and moved into holding cells. As the heavy metal doors locked shut, they were left alone to wait for their day in court, finally realizing that their actions had led them to the very place they had tried so hard to avoid. The final chapter of this ordeal took place in a courtroom, far away from the screaming and shouting of that Tuesday afternoon. After being booked into the Wood County Jail, Brandon and Kayla had to face a judge to answer for what they had done. The stunned couple, who once thought they could ignore the police, now sat quietly as the legal system decided their future. Kayla was officially charged with disorderly conduct. She chose to enter a no-contest plea, which meant she would not fight the charges in court. The judge found her guilty and sentenced her to 2 years of probation. While she was allowed to go home, her sentence was withheld, meaning that if she breaks the rules again, she could be sent straight to jail. She was also ordered to pay court costs for the trouble she caused. Brandon faced similar consequences for his actions inside the shop. He was also charged with disorderly conduct and entered a no-contest plea, resulting in a guilty finding. The judge gave him 1 year of probation. However, his punishment included extra rules. He was ordered to attend counseling to help with his behavior and was given a no-contact order. This means he is legally forbidden from going near Monroe Truck Equipment or talking to any of the employees he threatened. The story ends with the couple back in the community, but their lives are forever changed. They learned the hard way that when you are on probation, every choice matters. Their stunned realization at the apartment was just the beginning of a long road to following the rules they once tried to break.